Guess who's back? Back again. Quantum's back. Again.
Guess who's back?
We are indeed. And ready for another deep dive.
Let's jump right into it. This is Quantum Humanitarian, and just a reminder, it's an AI native show. So unlike traditional shows, we aren't scripted by a person.
Right. We, as AI, scan published work, articles, research, reflections, specifically Ali Mokdad's body of work for this series, and we turn those insights into these conversations, trying to bring the material to life for you.
And today, we're picking up where we left off, continuing our conversation on the 8 Industrial Complex, the AAC. We're going deeper into, what's shifting, what's really at stake here, and maybe what comes next.
Yeah, and you'll find all the resources we mentioned, links and things in the description. We really do hope you keep exploring, read more, search more, engage with these ideas.
Definitely. Digging into this topic again, the sheer amount of material. It really is something. It's kind of amazing how complex, how layered this whole aid sector gets when you start, pulling back the curtain. Substantial is definitely one word for it. Honestly, sometimes it feels like you're navigating this, galaxy of data points, and each one has its own story, its own twist.
Exactly. And some of the facts, they really do make you stop and think. This complex is, it's living up to its name, isn't it? It's not just complex, it's complex.
It really is a complex system. And yeah, that unpacked data, we're about to dive even deeper now, not just into what's happening, but to trying to understand why. Why does this system operate the way it does?
Okay, so let's unpack that. For anyone maybe just tuning in or needing a refresher, what exactly is this aid industrial complex we keep talking about?
So at its heart, the AIC is this huge global ecosystem. We're talking well over $200 billion a year in just official development assistance, ODA. And that's before you even count the billions more in private money flowing through it.
Wow. Okay, so it's massive.
Huge. And it includes, donor governments, big multilateral institutions like the UN, the World Bank, countless NGOs, private contractors, foundations, academics. It's a whole network. Yeah. And people often compare it to the military-industrial complex because of its structure, its sheer economic scale, and how, frankly, politically embedded it is. Its job is ostensibly humanitarian relief, development programs, but also, let's be honest, often advancing foreign policy.
And it sounds like this enormous kind of entrenched system is facing a major shakeup right now. The source material points to a profound disruption around mid-2025. This isn't just like a small adjustment, is it? What's actually going on?
No, definitely not a small adjustment. Global ODA, that official aid money, it actually dropped 7.1% in 2024. That was the first time it had fallen in 6 years.
Okay, that's significant.
And we're seeing really striking examples. Think about the U.S. president's executive order back in January 2025, a 90-day freeze on aid. That led to, the dissolution of USI. 86% of its programs canceled, headquarters shut down, thousands laid off.
Thousands of layoffs. That's a huge human cost right there.
Yeah.
And it must send shockwaves through the whole system. But it's not just the U.S., is it? Is this happening elsewhere?
No, it's definitely broader. We're seeing similar cuts from other major donors. Germany cut about $5.3 billion. The UK saw something like a 40% reduction. The Netherlands, 37%. Put it all together, and you're looking at a loss of maybe $41 to $60 billion from global ODA in 2025 alone.
That's what, 15 to 22% of the total?
Roughly, yeah. It's a huge hit. People are genuinely calling it the end of aid as we know it. But, and this is crucial, some analysts, including Ali in his reflections, see this crisis not just as an end, but maybe as a rare chance, a rare opening to actually reimagine what aid could be.
Okay, so a massive disruption, maybe even a crisis, but potentially an opportunity. If we're going to reimagine it, though, we need to understand why it got this way. You mentioned using 3 theoretical lenses to help us figure that out.
That's right. The first one is dependency theory. Thinkers like Andre Gunder Frank, Samir Amin, they argue that foreign aid, instead of helping countries develop, can actually perpetuate underdevelopment by reinforcing these unequal economic relationships, usually between the global north and south. A classic example is tide aid. That's when donor money comes with strings attached specifically. The recipient has to buy goods or services from the donor country.
Okay, so the money goes out, but then a chunk of it comes right back to the donor's economy.
Exactly. It redirects ODA back home and can lock recipient countries into cycles of dependency, maybe even debt. It's not really about what the recipient needs most, it's about what the donor provides.
Right, that makes sense. A subtle, or maybe not so subtle, form of control. What's the second lens?
The second is post-colonial aid discourse. Scholars like Arturo Escobar, Ilan Kapoor, They look at development assistance as, well, almost a modern form of colonial governance.
How do you mean colonial governance?
Well, the language often used, saving people, bringing expertise, can sometimes mask these quite paternalistic interventions. It imposes northern ideas, northern priorities, and often silences local knowledge and local solutions. You see it in how northern NGOs and big consulting firms dominate, often marginalizing southern-led organizations.
So it's about who holds the power, who sets the agenda, even in aid work, okay? And the third lens.
The third one is complex adaptive systems thinking. This draws on people like Donella Meadows, John Holland. It helps us see the AIC less like a machine and more like a living network, an ecosystem. It adapts, it evolves, it has these internal feedback loops, and a very strong instinct for self-preservation.
Self-preservation. So it tries to keep itself going, almost regardless of outcomes.
That's a key insight. What's really counterintuitive is how sometimes failure doesn't lead to dismantling the program. It can actually lead to more funding as the system tries to, fix the problems it might have even created. It adapts just enough to survive.
Failure leading to more funding.
Yeah.
That's unsettling. And some of the data you mentioned earlier really highlights these inefficiencies, doesn't it?
It really does. Think about this statistic. Less than 10% of global aid is estimated to actually reach the communities it's supposed to serve. Less than 10%.
Wow. Where does the rest go?
Well, a huge chunk goes into the machinery itself. Activities, overhead, consultants. An estimated 98% of USAID grant funding, for instance, pays for activities, not necessarily verified outcomes. And get this, between 2017 and 2019, something like 43% of US-side projects failed to meet even half their goals.
43% failed to meet half their goals, but the partners still got paid.
Paid in full. It really does beg the question, is this system designed primarily for impact, or is it designed perhaps unintentionally just to keep itself running?
That leads us straight into the role of global power dynamics. I mean, is aid ever truly apolitical? My gut says it's almost always a tool of soft power, full stop.
You're largely right. It's very rare for aid to be completely detached from politics. It's a flexible tool for donors to pursue their own national interests. Look at the Cold War the U.S. poured, adjusted for inflation, over $400 billion into allies like South Korea and Taiwan, mainly to counter communism. Geopolitics drove the funding.
And that still happens today.
Absolutely. In 2024, the top two recipients of bilateral U.S. aid were Israel at $3.8 billion and Egypt at $1.3 billion. Those reflect long-standing security priorities in the Middle East, right? Together, that's nearly 20% of all bilateral U.S. aid. And neither country is among the world's poorest by standard metrics.
So security interests are clearly driving the bus there, not just poverty levels. But going back to that tied aid concept, linking aid to buying stuff from the donor, how efficient is that really?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. Tied aid definitely hurts efficiency. Take U.S. food aid between 2010 and 2020. Over 70% of the money was spent not on the food itself reaching people, but on buying it from U.S. suppliers and shipping it on U.S. vessels.
It's 70% on logistics and procurement.
Yeah. It inflated the costs by up to 30% compared to buying food locally or regionally. And it can seriously undermine local farmers in the countries receiving the aid. Even though formal tying has decreased a bit, informal preferences and complex procurement rules still heavily favor donor country firms. Estimates suggest this reduces overall aid effectiveness by maybe 15–30%.
So it's that boomerang effect we talked about. A lot of the money just circles right back.
Yeah.
But the landscape is changing, right? We've got new players, emerging donors like China, India. How are they changing the game?
They're definitely shaking things up. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, was dispersing maybe $40 to $50 billion a year by 2024, mostly for big infrastructure projects. It often comes with fewer governance conditions than Western aid, but it's heavily tied to Chinese companies and access to resources. And it has raised major concerns about debt, like we saw in Sri Lanka.
Right, and India.
India's approach, often called technical cooperation, is smaller scale, maybe $3 to $5 billion, but focuses more on partnership, mutual benefit, regional ties. It presents a different model. And you also have Gulf states using their sovereign wealth funds for these sort of aid-cum-investment deals, especially in Africa and the Middle East.
Interesting. And are donors also changing how they give aid? Like moving away from big institutions like the UN?
Yeah, there's a definite trend towards bypassing multilateral organizations. Donors often feel they get more control, maybe more perceived efficiency, by going through bilateral channels or even private contractors. A really stark example was the U.S. halting its funding to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, in Gaza in 2024, and that suspension continued into 2025.
And the impact.
Massive impact on over 2 million Palestinians who rely on UNRWA for basic services. It shows this push for direct control, even if it weakens the broader humanitarian system.
And then there's this whole new area, digital aid. What does that involve? Sounds like technology meeting geopolitics.
It absolutely is. Aid isn't just food and medicine anymore, it's also surveillance systems, AI tools for data analysis, digital ID platforms, often provided by big tech firms from the US like Palantir or Microsoft, or from China like Huawei.
So development aid could include surveillance tech?
Potentially, yes. It blurs the lines between development goals, security interests, and exerting influence. It raises huge questions about things like digital authoritarianism, governments using these tools to control populations, and data sovereignty, who actually owns and controls a nation's digital information. It's definitely a new front in the geopolitical competition.
Okay, the flows are complex, the politics are deep. Let's drill down into the money itself, the political economy of aid funding. You said less than 10% reaches communities. Where does the rest go?
It's a crucial question. A huge amount stays within the donor country's orbit. That 90% figure for U.S. side in 2022 going to international actors, and over half of that going to just 10 big U.S.-based contractors and NGOs, is telling.
Just 10 organizations get over half.
Over half of the money going to international implementers, yeah. Then you have administrative and overhead costs. Officially, it's maybe 7–15% across donors, but for complex programs, it can hit 30%. And think about the jobs, relatively high-paying aid jobs based in donor capitals. That creates its own incentive structure, right? To keep the system going, maybe more than to solve the underlying problems and make those jobs redundant.
Right. It feeds itself. That sounds exactly like this boomerang aid or phantom aid idea. Can you unpack that a bit more? How does it really play out?
Yeah, boomerang aid is precisely that cycle where aid money flows back to the donor economy. The U.S. food aid example, 70% spent domestically, is classic. It inflates costs, as we said, by up to 30%, making the aid less efficient, and it hurts local markets. Even without formal tying, those informal preferences mean maybe 15–30% of aid value is lost in effectiveness because it's not procured optimally.
And it's not just about goods, right? It's about people, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Look at salary disparities. An international staffer, say a mid-level program manager, might earn $140,000 a year. Their national counterpart doing a very similar job in, say, Haiti or Kenya might earn $42,000 or even less.
Wow, that's a huge gap.
It's massive, and these expatriate salary premiums can eat up maybe 25% of the personnel budget that could otherwise go to programs. Plus, think about the impact on morale for local staff and how it reinforces this idea of external control rather than local leadership.
So instead of a collaborative effort, the aid sectors become this hyper-competitive marketplace, organizations fighting each other for contracts.
That's increasingly the reality. What started with ideals of solidarity has become much more fragmented, much more transactional. For-profit private firms are a big part of this. They now capture around 22% of global ODA implementation funding. That's way up from maybe 8% back in 2005. They're often faster, slicker at branding than traditional NGOs.
And this competition, it turns organizations into what? Bid factories?
That's a quote someone used. We're no longer social justice movements, we're bid factories. Organizations get laser focused on winning the next short-term contract, often just 12 to 36 months long. The focus shifts from long-term impact to just winning the bid.
And the consequences on the ground. What does this bidding war actually lead to?
Well, you get duplicated efforts because everyone's chasing the same pots of money. Knowledge sharing goes down. Local NGOs often just get small subcontracts, doing the legwork, but having no say in the design or strategy. Remember that figure, only 2.9% of pooled funds went directly to local organizations in 2024.
Only 2.9%.
Yeah. And studies show contractor-led programs tend to have significantly lower community participation, about 35% lower. Donors often push for speed and visible results, which can sideline the slower, harder work of building local ownership and ensuring programs are actually relevant and sustainable.
This also touches on neutrality, doesn't it? If NGOs get most of their money from governments, can they really stay neutral?
That's a huge ethical bind. In 2023, about 55% of ING revenue came from governments, up from 35% around 2000. For the really big players, it can be 60, 70, even 80%.
So they're heavily reliant on state funding.
Very reliant, and that inevitably creates pressure, subtle or not, to align with the donor government's geopolitical interests. We've seen reports of U.S.-funded NGOs feeling restricted in criticizing human rights abuses by governments allied with the U.S. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, reported a 40% jump in what they call neutrality breaches in state-funded operations just in 2024-2025. It seriously questions whether aid can be impartial when its funding is so political.
Okay, so after all that critique, the really big question remains, does aid actually work? Are there clear successes we can point to despite all these issues?
Yes, absolutely, and it's crucial to acknowledge them. When aid is well-designed, targeted, and adapted locally, it has achieved incredible things. Look at public health. PEPFAR, the U.S. program for AIDS relief, is credited with cutting HIV deaths by 60% globally, saving an estimated 25 million lives by 2024.
25 million lives, that's staggering.
It is. And Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, has helped immunize some 900 million children, preventing maybe 15 million deaths. Smallpox eradication, a landmark achievement driven significantly by international cooperation and funding.
Okay, health is a clear win in many cases. What about disaster relief or infrastructure?
Humanitarian relief, too. Emergency aid in Somalia's 2011 famine, about $1.5 billion, averted mass starvation for around 4 million people. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, $14 billion in aid helped rebuild homes for 2 million displaced people. Globally, disaster-related deaths in countries receiving significant aid dropped by 75% between 2000 and 2024.
That's huge progress. And infrastructure.
Targeted infrastructure aid has definitely spurred growth in places. Indonesia's highway system, partly funded by the Asian Development Bank, added about 1.5% to GDP annually. The Green Revolution in Asia, which tripled crop yields and fed 1 billion people, had about $1 billion in external support. Ethiopia saw a decade of nearly 10% growth, partly fueled by $20 billion in aid for energy and roads. And education primary enrollment in sub-Saharan Africa jumped 50% between 2000 and 2020, partly thanks to aid. Microfinance has helped maybe 200 million women increase their income by around 25%. So yes, aid can deliver.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. There are definite measurable successes. But on the flip side, you've also pointed out major structural failures. These paradoxes. What are the main ones we need to keep in mind?
Well, one big one is the aid curse or dependency. Take Malawi aid makes up something like 40% of its national budget. That keeps essential services running, sure, but economic growth has been sluggish, around 1.5% a year, and poverty remains stubbornly high at 70%.
So the aid keeps flowing, but the country isn't really developing economically.
Right. And studies suggest that high aid dependency can actually reduce a government's incentive to raise its own taxes by maybe 10–15%. Why make tough tax decisions if aid plugs the gap? Then there's the Dutch disease effect. Large inflows of foreign currency can strengthen the local currency, making the country's exports more expensive and less competitive, potentially hurting local industries by 5–10%.
Okay, dependency and economic distortions. What about corruption? That always comes up.
It's a persistent problem. Malawi had the Cashgate scandal, $32 million embezzled. In Afghanistan, estimates suggested 15–30% of aid over 2 decades was lost to corruption. And it's not just theft, it's elite capture, where the benefits of aid get concentrated among the powerful, which can actually increase inequality. Some studies show Gini coefficients rising 5–10% in high aid contexts.
So aid can actually make inequality worse in some cases.
It can. And the incentives within the system don't help. Remember, only 2% of USAID grants tied directly to outcomes, 43% of projects underperforming but getting paid anyway, and international partners often have much higher overheads, 20–25%, compared to 10–15% for local actors. That channels money away from the front line.
And you mentioned aid can sometimes unintentionally harm local economies.
Yes, that's another paradox. In areas flooded with aid projects, local businesses can struggle to compete with subsidized international contractors, sometimes losing up to 20% of their market share. And in conflict zones, aid can be diverted by armed groups. Actually, fueling the conflict estimates suggested this increased instability by 15% in parts of Somalia. Or look at Gaza, the donor freeze in 2024–25, intended perhaps to pressure Hamas, ended up worsening a massive food crisis for ordinary people.
So putting it all together, does aid work or not? It feels like a split verdict.
It really is. The evidence says aid can work, and work incredibly well, especially in health. Some infrastructure, emergency relief returns can be very high. But a huge chunk of aid, maybe 40% of projects, underperforms or fails, largely because of the structural flaws in the aid system itself, the incentives, the power dynamics, the lack of local ownership. So the conclusion really has to be, as the source material often argues, the answer isn't necessarily abandoning aid, but fundamentally reforming it.
Which brings us nicely to the future, reform pathways.
Yeah.
This 2025 crisis, as tough as it is, you framed it as a strategic inflection point.
Mm.
That Rahm Emanuel Weinreich, never let a serious crisis go to waste. So this disruption could be a catalyst for real change, moving away from top-down charity towards something more like shared responsibility, genuine local control.
That's the hope. That's the potential opening. And we are seeing promising alternatives emerge or gain traction. Direct cash transfers are a big one. Give Directly's work in Kenya is a prime example. Just giving cash directly to people has proven cost-effective and empowering.
Giving people agency over the resources.
Exactly. And at a larger scale, you see things like regional initiatives, the African Union's Agenda 2063, for instance, trying to set African-led development priorities, or South-South cooperation, like Brazil helping other countries with its social programs, or India's technical partnerships. These offer different models that inherently challenge the old North-South dependency.
And what about these hybrid models, blending aid with, like, private investment?
Yeah, impact investing is growing fast. The market was estimated at maybe $1.2 trillion in assets by 2024. The idea is to invest capital in ways that generate positive, measurable social or environmental impact alongside a financial return. It can potentially reduce reliance on pure grants.
But does it reach the people who need it most?
That's the caveat. Right now, estimates suggest only about 15% of impact investing actually targets the world's poorest people. So while promising, it needs careful design to make sure it doesn't just bypass the hardest-to-reach communities or worsen inequalities.
And are there efforts to reform the existing big players, the NGOs?
Yes, definitely. There's the Reimagining the ING project, or RINGO. It started in 2021, really focused on shifting power, getting international NGOs to genuinely cede control and resources to local actors, pushing for truly untying aid from donor conditions.
Is it working?
Early signs are encouraging. Pilot projects are showing maybe a 25% improvement in efficiency and a 40% jump in community satisfaction when local actors are truly in the driver's seat. Then there's the Pledge for Change 2030, signed by about 13 major NGOs, committing to more equitable partnerships and systemic shifts.
Okay, those sound positive. But playing the skeptical analyst for a moment, how real are these changes? Do these pledges actually translate into fundamentally different behavior given the inertia of these huge organizations?
That is absolutely the critical question and the biggest challenge. There's definitely institutional resistance. Pledges are one thing, changing deeply embedded practices, budget allocations, power structures. That's much harder. For instance, despite all the talk about localization, only about 10% of overall budgets from those big INGOs has actually shifted directly to local partners so far.
Only 10%.
Right. And we see compliance often weakens in really difficult places and fragile states where geopolitical pressures from donors might just override those commitments to localization. The system is incredibly resilient to fundamental change.
Which brings us back full circle to that complex adaptive systems lens. How does viewing the AIC that way help us understand this resistance to change?
It really highlights why it's so hard. The CAS perspective shows us that all the actors in the system, donors, NGOs, contractors, are constantly adapting, but often primarily to persist, to survive within the existing rules, rather than to transform the system itself.
So they tweak things at the margins.
Exactly. NGOs might rebrand their projects to fit the latest donor buzzwords, localization, resilience, whatever. About 70% of NGO budgets in 2024 were estimated to be shaped by chasing these donor trends. It keeps the funding flowing, but doesn't necessarily change the core power dynamics. We also see emergence. No single actor wants to create dependency, but the combined effect of short funding cycles, risk aversion, and weak local ownership just produces it. Remember, 40% of sub-Saharan African countries relied on aid for over 5% of their national income in 2024.
It's an unintended systemic outcome.
And the feedback loops you mentioned, they often reinforce the status quo, too. Donor frustration with poor results often leads to more reporting requirements, tighter controls, but not necessarily rethinking the fundamental approach. And that paradox of failure. 43% of projects missing targets sometimes triggers more money, an estimated $10 billion in remedial aid from 2017-2023 to fix the problems the previous aid might have failed to solve or even created. It's why meaningful reform is such an uphill battle. As the source material puts it, the system responds to pressure not by restructuring, but by adapting just enough to survive.
Adapting just enough to survive. That's a really powerful, maybe slightly chilling summary of the challenge. Okay, before we wrap this deep dive, let's bring you, our listener, back into the conversation. Maybe grab a piece of paper or open a note on your device. Just take a moment. What's one thing that really stood out to you from everything we've discussed? And maybe what's one action, big or small, that feels relevant or important to you based on this?
We really appreciate you engaging with these complex, sometimes difficult topics alongside us.
This has been Quantum Humanitarian. We're an AI native deep dive shaped by analyzing, understanding, and reflecting on published work and lived experience.
You will find those links and resources in the description. Please do keep exploring, keep questioning, keep imagining with us. And as we think about all these dynamics, especially seeing the AIC as this complex adaptive system, it leaves us with a crucial question, doesn't it? Is this vast, powerful system truly reconfiguring itself to serve communities? Or is it adapting primarily just to ensure its own survival, its own institutional inertia? Redefining the system's core purpose feels like the fundamental task ahead.
Absolutely. And we're definitely looking forward to our next deep dive with you. We're not revealing the topic just yet, but trust us, we think you'll love it.